The story of VeeJay Records.
In the history of popular culture, most people think of Berry Gordy and Motown Records as being the only example of African-American success in the music industry. It was independent, and the company made its own deals and discovered talent whose contributions are still being felt today. But before Motown, there was an African-American husband and wife team who turned a mom-and-pop record label into one of the most successful stories in music history. Based in Chicago, Illinois, Vivian Carter and Jimmy Bracken built a mini empire, rich with talent. And man, could they make records.
Good night, sweetheart. Well, it's time to go. Oh, what a night. Can't you hear me when I'm raindrops? So many raindrops. He don't love you like I love you. If he did, he wouldn't break your heart. Doop, 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 dook-a-bell, doop, doop, dook-a-bell. Sherry, baby, please, 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 oh yeah, like I please you. Please, oh yeah, like I please you. Please, oh yeah, like I please you.
This is the story of one of the most successful independent black-owned record labels, VeeJay Records. I'm Bob Slade, and for the next hour, we're going to travel back in time. We're going to take a look at the rise and fall of VeeJay. Joining us on this journey is a man who was a major part of our Good Rockin' Tonight History of Black Music series, music historian Johnny Meadow. Good to have you back. Thank you very much for participating in this.
It's always nice to be asked to return, Bob.
The year 1953. America is still a segregated nation, and even more segregated culturally. R&B, or black music of that era, was referred to by whites as race music. The recording industry was a way out of poverty for many young African Americans. You could make a record for next to nothing, and if you were lucky, well, you could have a hit on your hands and money in your pocket. Exposure of R&B or race music was limited to the small number of black radio stations around the country. Nighttime disc jockeys on popular white stations like Hunter Hancock in Los Angeles and Alan Freed here in New York. And then there was also jukebox plays. VeeJay Records was formed in 1953, but not in the city of Chicago, which later became its home base. Gary, Indiana is where the label got its start. Johnny Meadow is here with more on that story.
There's a lady named Vivian Carter who's a radio listener, and she listens to a very prominent disc jockey in Chicago named Al Benson. Al Benson for Coca-Cola. That's the way he sounded on the radio, and he was very big there, very, very successful. He had a contest for a male and female DJ. She became the winner of the female, and a fellow named Sid McCoy, whom you'll remember from Doc Tarry, as well as the radio voice of Pet Milk, he became the male DJ. And they each did 15-minute segments on the Al Benson show. So she became a radio announcer. She did a show called Living with Vivian. Her beau, who became a husband, had a record store in Gary. His name was Jimmy Bracken. What we had was the V from Vivian, the J from Jimmy, gave us VeeJay. She figured out, and they figured out, if she was on the radio, they didn't have a problem getting records played. So they put some records out.
Okay, now, what was the move to Chicago? What was that all about now?
Okay. Their record started making some noise in Gary. They had two pieces of product on the market. They had something called High and Lonesome from Jimmy Reed, and something from the Spaniels, which was a local group from Gary. Something called Bounce and Baby It's You, actually a two-sided hit. And they were so small that they needed national distribution. They were approached by somebody named Art Sheridan, who had a successful operation in Chicago then called Chance Records. And that became the Chicago tie-in. In other words, Benson was a Chicago disc jockey. Chicago and Gary, Indiana are not that far apart. As a matter of fact, there's a Gary, Indiana daytime station, WMPP, that beams into Chicago. It was a black station. So Chicago and Gary are really like connection cities, kind of Brooklyn, Queens, that kind of thing. And that was the Chicago connection, Chance being the initial distributor of the initial VeeJay product.
VeeJay's first successful record was its 7th release. Goodnight, Sweetheart, Goodnight sold over 300,000 R&B sales and was a pop hit for a female group called McGuire Sisters. They covered the song for the white charts. It was a bigger hit for them, but VeeJay was shrewd enough in that it managed to cash in on their success because the label owned the publishing on the song.
One of their publishing companies was Conrad Music, named after Jimmy Bracken's middle name, Conrad. And generally, with most of the performers they signed, most wrote their own material. So if they did, VeeJay took the publishing from them. And it ended up Conrad Music became a very lucrative entity. As a matter of fact, it was on a $50,000 a year guarantee from BMI. And towards the end of the VeeJay story, when they were going down the tubes, it was probably the only asset they had to collateralize when they borrowed money from Chess. He collateralized the $65,000 loan with a publishing company, and it ended up being part of Arc Music, which was Chess's publishing division.
So they had the publishing on the earlier records. They had the publishing on Goodnight, Sweetheart.
Many others.
So when the white pop acts would come and cover their songs, they made sure they got some cash out of it.
Oh, sure. Sheet music sales plus mechanical royalties from the sales of records, and performance money from Performance Society for being played on the radio.
A smart move on their part. Whose idea was to do that?
You have to understand, if they had Conrad Music, okay, obviously somebody told Jimmy, okay, that was a move that should have been made. Because Jimmy's background wasn't necessarily that of a detail man. That's where Chance came in, and that's where a man named Ewart Abner comes in. Abner became their general manager years later, swinging over from Chance after Chance folded about 1954 to VeeJay. So obviously somebody had to guide Jimmy. That wouldn't necessarily be Jimmy's move, although the firm was named after him. And even in Vivian's case, they didn't necessarily know that much about the business side of the business. They relied on other people.
Those other people included Vivian Carter's brother, Calvin Tolly Carter. Calvin Carter was the label's A&R man. He made the record. So you had Calvin Carter producing and Ewart Abner as the accountant, the salesman, and the pitch man for VeeJay.
Just like she did before.
The hits kept coming as VeeJay scored with the El Dorados and At My Front Door in 1955, a song covered by Pat Boone. But by 1957, VeeJay was ready to spread its wings. It had success with blues acts like Jimmy Reed and John Lee Hooker, and vocal groups like the Cool Gents, the Magnificents, and the Dells.
I love you so.
The Dells and the El Dorados backed up many of the acts on the VeeJay label. Johnny Meadow tells us about the Dells.
They started with the Chess people in Chicago under the name the El Rays, and Leonard Chess told Marvin Jr. that he better get some kind of education because he couldn't sing at all. So they went across the street to VeeJay. They had a very early release, number 118, called Tell the World, but that wasn't the hit for them. But once again, if VeeJay believed, they seemed to stay with the artist. That seemed to be a commitment that Calvin made. Ultimately, they had a very successful record with Oh What a Night. And they had a couple of other records after that. Once again, the discographers like Pain in My Heart, Why Do You Have to Go? But they only really, at VeeJay, had the one big hit of Oh What a Night.
When R&B, a.k.a. rock and roll, grabbed the whole of the country by 1957, VeeJay was right there in the mix. What they needed, however, was someone to break through to those pop stations.
They hired a white man. They hired a man who was a disc jockey in Philadelphia and a former record manufacturer named Red Schwartz. He had a record company called Red Top, and that was the name he used on the air on a black station, WDAS in Philadelphia. They hired Red to be their national promotion man out of Philadelphia. Red had some experience doing promotion, though. He worked for their local distributor there. And Red ran around the country to radio stations, to record distributors, and people reacted to him. You work for that little colored company in Chicago? But Red was a player who made a major difference. Once again, you have to give Abner credit for these kind of moves.
And Calvin Carter was right in there, too, on the talent end. Eddie Thomas was a local manager of groups, and he brought one of his acts to VeeJay and Calvin Carter. That act later became known as The Impressions. Eddie would eventually go into business with Curtis Mayfield, and they would form Curtom. That's later on. But in 1957, Eddie Thomas was a struggling manager.
Well, it became the ball of VeeJay was an accident, actually. I was managing a group in Chicago, a local group called the Medallionaires, and we had a small contract with Mercury Records. And in the process of rehearsal area that we lived in, there was a group named the Roosters. They rehearsed right close by us in Sewell Park in Chicago. So I happened to go to a talent show in Chicago at one of the high schools there. Washburn Trade School. It comes back to me now, clear as a bell. Washburn Trade School. That was a school that later became Cooley High, but it was Washburn Trade School at that time. And on this talent show, the Roosters were performing. And I heard this group. I said, wow, they were fantastic. And they knew I managed the Medallionaires, and so they said, well, why don't you come in and help us out, too? We need help, you know. We could use a manager. You could help them two groups. I said, well, I'll give it a try. So I went to rehearsal, and I heard them perform, heard them singing, and I said, oh, these guys are just super. I said, fellas, the one thing I don't like, I'm really unhappy with your name, the Roosters. I said, that doesn't sound professional. It has no ring to it, no class to it. You know, I said, we should come up with something different. So we all went out and come up with some suggested names. Later on, I came up with one called, I had two choices that I brought in. I had the Victorians and the Impressions. And seemingly, the first one stuck. It stuck like glue, the Impressions. And they asked, well, why did you come up with that name? I said, well, it's because when I first met you, and I heard you sing, and I heard the style you were singing, and I was terribly impressed. So I thought, well, since I was impressed, Impressions would be just right.
Now, who were the members of the Impressions when you...
The original members of the Impressions were the very original. Now, there was Arthur Brooks and Richard Brooks, two brothers from Chattanooga, Tennessee, and Sam Gooden, who also hailed from Chattanooga, Tennessee. And those were the brothers, the three that came to Chicago. They came to Chicago and they met Curtis Mayfield. And Curtis Mayfield, in turn, knew a guy was singing in church named Jerry Butler. So it became Jerry Butler, Curtis Mayfield, the two brothers, and Sam Gooden. That was the original 5 Impressions. Your Precious Love, I knew that was a hit. We used to rehearse it. Every time we rehearsed it, it was just a knockout. The background, the Jerry delivery, you know, he did hit a Roy Hamilton style delivery, and it was just so dramatic. You know, it just, you know, hey, it knocked you over every time you hear it. You love to hear it. And when we went to VeeJay Records, actually what happened was, that's how we got to VeeJay was interesting, because originally we went to Chess Records. And the Chess Records was at 13th and State, all record row at that time. And Ralph Bass was the A&R man. He came in and we auditioned for him. He said, no, I'm not interested. So, okay. We got our bags and packed and went down about 5 or 6 blocks to Chess Records, 2120 South Michigan. And Phil Chess heard the group and said, well, they were doing too well. They had Billy Stewart and they had all the big stars over there, so they really didn't need a group per se. But so we went across the street from Chess Records was a little label called VeeJay Records. And then we went across the street, and Calvin Carter, who was the chief, the A&R man, auditioned the group. And first song we did for him was Sweet Was the Wine. That sort of warmed him up. He said, And I said, okay, fellows, let him have it. As we did For Your Precious Love. That was it. We were in the studio recording that song within 2 weeks. And the rest is history.
But Eddie Thomas admits he was not a very smart manager. He did not have a contract on Butler, and VeeJay knew it. And they went after Jerry Butler.
The first set of records came out of VeeJay Records was The Impressions, only For Your Precious Love. I made the first 100,000. And once the record took off like lightning, they switched it to Abner Records. And Abner Records is where they made Jerry Butler in huge giant print and put the Impressions in magnifying glass prints. So therefore, the DJs who began to pick up on the record after it took off began to say Jerry Butler. Some would say the Impressions, but the Impressions were so small written on the label that it's Jerry Butler, For Your Precious Love. And that's how they boosted Jerry Butler. Eventually, after the record got so popular, they were able to entice him to come on as a single. They offered him, I never forget, they gave Jerry Butler 1957 Mercury, a couple $1,000 in cash. And here's a kid that's living in the projects. That's where Jerry lived, in the projects. Can you imagine what that meant to him? that was like a whole world to him. He had no problem going on as a single. He had no valid contract with me, so thus Jerry Butler went on his own, and the Impressions, we stayed there for a couple more records, but they weren't really interested in pushing the group.
VeeJay had its first solo male pop star, but he would end up taking a backseat to a man named Delector Clark.
I don't know why. There's no sun up in the sky. Stormy weather.
Stormy Weather by Pookie Hudson and the Spaniels was another record that received pop as well as R&B airplay. This was the direction that VeeJay was heading toward. Calvin Carter, the label's A&R man, was good at picking new talent. He managed to pull Jerry Butler away from Eddie Thomas and his group, The Impressions. And when the group fell on hard times, so did Eddie, according to music historian Johnny Meadow.
He was shining Jerry Butler's shoes. 3 records later, Jerry Butler was a soloist. The Impressions were an act with Curtis leading that wasn't meeting with any success. And Eddie Thomas, who was the manager of The Impressions, was now Jerry Butler's chauffeur and valet.
I had to suffer a little bit, and I say suffer. We all have to go through a suffering period. Jerry Butler was doing well with VeeJay Records, and the group was starving, and Jerry asked me to come on the road as his valet. And I said to myself, that's going to be a tough job to swallow, tough pill to swallow to go out and do that, but it might give me a chance to meet some disc jockeys across the country, make some friends, make some contacts, and I thought about that side of it. I said, everywhere Jerry would go, I could make friends. I said, it would work out. And I could save my money, and that's what I did. So took me a little while to save up enough money, and the group, we saved, Curtis and I, put our little coins together. And when I came back in off the road with Jerry, we went in the studio, and we recorded a song that Curtis wrote that I thought was just fantastic, called Gypsy Woman. And we recorded it down at Universal Studio downtown and paid our little money. We could have put it together. So then I knew I had to go to New York to try and get a record deal, but I had to wait until we had an engagement in New York because I couldn't afford to travel to New York. So finally, we got an appearance that Jerry Butler, I'm speaking of now, had an engagement at the Apollo Theater in Harlem. Never forget that. So during the daytime, I would sneak downtown, not necessarily sneak, but I would go downtown early, get up early, and try and paddle this master. I went to RCA Victor first, and I talked to Ray Ellis, and he said, well, I can't see this being anything, I can't picture a black group singing about a gypsy woman. This didn't sound right. I went to another company, RCA, well, RCA was the first one, I'm sorry, then I went to a couple other labels. Then I finally went to ABC Paramount. Clarence Avon was there. Clarence and I became good friends. He liked me right away, and he took me in. And Larry Newton was the president of ABC Paramount Records. They didn't really need a group because they had B.B. King. They just had B.B. King, they had Ray Charles. They had Paul Anka, Tommy Rowe. So they were, and Lloyd Price. So they were doing quite well. But their theory was, well, hey, they weren't going to give me any advance money for the master, so they had nothing to lose. And their motto was, things that they didn't care about too much, if it sticks, fine. If it doesn't, forget about it. But to me, it meant the life, it meant everything to me. It meant my whole world. But this is where my traveling with Jerry paid off, because I met a lot of DJs all through the Carolinas. You know, we traveled all over. And everywhere I went, I made sure I go to the radio station to plug in Jerry, but I also plug in myself. I said, when I come on the record, you guys give me a hand. And I never forget Philadelphia, Lloyd Fatman, Georgie Woods, Rockin' Robin. These guys were, and a promotion man named Matty Singer, they called him the Humdinger. David Rose was our distributor, took over. And we really got it started. Those guys really gave me a big push, and then the record started happening.
And Gypsy Woman became a monstrous hit. While Jerry Butler was being readied for pop acceptance, Calvin Carter discovered a new voice in one of his local groups. It belonged to a young man named Delector Clark. His first name was shortened to D, and he quickly surpassed Jerry Butler as VeeJay's top pop star.
Hey, little girl in the high school sweater. Gee, but I'd like to know you better.
Delector Clark had a long career, actually, as an entertainer. He started with Red Saunders Hambone Kids in the early 1950s. Then when he was in high school, he was part of a group at Marshall High School called the Golden Tones. He made some records for VeeJay under the name The Cool Gents. That's what they called the group, named after a Chicago disc jockey, Herb Kent, the Cool Gent. Actually, Herb at the time, I think, was at WBE in Harvey, Illinois. And later on, again, the same group, they did some covers. They called themselves the Delegates, D led. Then finally, D wanted to go solo. And initially, they made a couple of records that weren't too successful. But, once again, if Calvin believed, he believed. The streak started with a record on Abner called Nobody But You. And after that, V. Clark had hit after hit after hit. Just keep it up and see what happens. How about that? Hey, little girl in a high school sweater.
One of my favorites.
And, of course, the career eclipse with the record he'd never topped. Got to number 1 on Cashbox, number 2 on Billboard.
Oh, raindrops, so many raindrops.
And why was D. Clark so successful? Eddie Thomas said he had the perfect pop appeal.
Because he went pop, which something very few black artists had an opportunity to do during that era. Because the pop stations were not playing black artists. No matter how big the record was, they wouldn't touch it. That was something that the black artists are enjoying well now, quite well now. But at that time, crossover pop, it had to almost sound white, and D. Clark was as close as they could get to sounding like a white artist, but yet he had the pop crossover song. So D. Clark was top dog, I would say, at that time on the label.
That's right. By the late 50s, VeeJay's expansion included gospel music, introducing such talents as the Staple Singers, the Five Blind Boys, and the Swan Silvertones. And they broke ground in the jazz field, signing artists like Eddie Harris, Wayne Shorter, and Lee Morgan. With D. Clark leading the pop roster and Jerry Butler the R&B side, VeeJay picked up a release on Gladys Knight and the Pips, and they picked up another release on a fella by the name of Gene Chandler. He was the Duke of Earl.
Duke of Earl, Duke.
The Duke of Earl. Actually, the Duquets. But when Calvin heard this, Duke, he told Funky Shepard, who produced that record with Carl Davis, he said, I like that. Hold that. I like that. And Bunky said, you can have it. Well, they put the record out, and typical of many things that happen in the record industry, it was not initially a success in the USA. The Duquets were only selling rhythm and blues records. It was a hit in England. Okay, they named Eugene Dixon, the lead singer, Gene Chandler after Carl Davis's favorite actor, Jeff Chandler. And they were advertising, it's number 1 in England. Well, that may have been really the forerunner of the English invasion here, because it sure took off and became a number 1 record here like Pronto.
It took 8 years, but VeeJay finally had a number 1 pop hit with the Duke of Earl. And Gene Chandler toured the country dressed in a top hat and tails and a monocle as the Duke. VeeJay was milking the act for all it could get. And they were spending money hand over fist to produce their acts. Spending like the big boys, the big record companies, forgetting that the company they had was still a mom-and-pop business.
The company just had everything going for them, and it's just unfortunate management, would turn them around. I think Abner, who was at the helms, Abner was looking off of Abner, unfortunately, and things just began to decline. The money was being spent, being wasted, wasn't being managed properly.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that's the downfall of many companies. You don't manage the funds right, they just don't work out right.
Yeah. Did you guys get your money when you were there? Or,
Well, we got what they gave us. The count was always their count. When you're dealing with distributors and you call them, say, press up 100,000. By the way, press up 50,000 and send it to my friend here in California. The count's going to be your count. Record companies had their own way of. They had control of that, and the artists only got what they wanted them to have. Basically, that's the way it went. It's a little more tight now, but at that time it was very loose. The artists only got 2%, 3%. When he got that, he'd have a giant record to get anything. Record companies had it made. Your only money you really made came on your engagements. That's where you really made out. But on record sales, etc., the company believe me, they got the best of that.
VeeJay's chase for the lucrative pop market would eventually lead to the label's downfall. 1961 was a big year for VeeJay Records. The small Chicago-based black-owned label was making strides up the pop charts with Dee Clark's Raindrops, Gene Chandler's #1 hit, The Duke of Earl, and Jerry Butler scored his biggest pop success to date, Moon River, the theme from the hit film Breakfast at Tiffany's. Ewart Abner even got fledgling songwriters Burt Bacharach and Hal David to work on a song for Jerry Butler, Make It Easy on Yourself.
Oh, breaking up is so very hard to do.
Burt Bacharach, once again, man, there's Abner making these ties and these connections, okay? You'd have to give him a certain amount of credit for doing certain things. As many bad moves as he made with Taurus Bulba, he made a good one on a one-shot with the connection with Bacharach.
Abner's next deal proved to be both good and bad. It was good in that it introduced the world to a brand new act, The Four Seasons, featuring Frankie Valli on lead vocals. Bad in that the deal cost VeeJay money. A lot of money.
Bob Crew had just come off of an unsuccessful association with an operation called Perry Records Inc., Perri. They didn't have any success at all. And it was funded by a man named Richard Osias. They just didn't have any luck at all. They put out some records and nothing seriously happened. And he got control of what he did there, and he had this record by a group called the Four Seasons, who were formerly the Four Lovers. They had some success in RCA years ago as the Four Lovers. He had a record called Sherry. The Four Seasons had recorded as the Four Seasons. Before on Gone Records, Crew had placed him there. Nothing happened. And he went down to a convention of a group that is no longer in existence. There was an organization called Armada, the American Record Manufacturers and Distributors Association. Abner was very active with that organization. And he went down there with this master, and he made a deal with Abner for VeeJay Records to release the Four Seasons for something like 16 cents a record. Well, needless to say, it was an instant hit. It was a real fake out because nobody thought a white act would appear on VeeJay Records. And not only was that an instant hit, but they had 2 #1 records behind it. They had 3 #1 records in a row. Sherry, Big Girls Don't Cry, and Walk Like a Man, and VeeJay Records was getting their brains kicked in. When it came accounting time, they realized they were losing 2 cents on every record.
Well, how'd that happen?
Whatever their overhead was and whatever it cost them to operate, they couldn't afford to give talent 16 cents a record. Plus 2 cents a record publishing the Crew is 20 cents a record they're giving away.
So like I said, they were losing 2 cents on each record. But they had to be making some money off of this stuff.
Well, you sell them for 46 cents a piece, and then you give 30% free goods, 300 free on 1,000. So what are you really selling them for? Okay, and how much is left to cover your overhead? Remember, VeeJay Records always spent a lot of money promoting product.
Were they the first one of those independent labels to spend a lot of money promoting? I mean, Atlantic spent a lot of money promoting, but what about
Well, when
VeeJay?
you say Atlantic spent a lot of money promoting, Jerry Wexler would tell you his promotion didn't cost him more than 1%.
Well, then how come VeeJay spent so much? How could they do that? Why did they do it?
They were very well received by the radio fraternity. They were very well liked. When people came into Chicago, they always came to see VeeJay. And Abner was, once again, public relations extraordinaire. I mean, he knew every stock boy and every record distributorship to get his stuff out. They just did it big time.
But the Four Seasons wanted their money big time. So they sued their producer, Bob Crew, who then sued VeeJay.
So they sue Crew for their money. Crew has to sue VeeJay. And Jimmy Bracken decides that it's time to relieve Mr. Abner of his chair. Anytime you make a deal where we're losing 2 cents a record, you kind of wear out your welcome.
And so what happened? He just let him go?
Well, we come into the new VeeJay. Abner very quickly sets up a sideline called Dart Record Sales Company. where he takes Spunky Shepard, and that gives him Gene Chandler. And they go in business and form a company called Constellation Records. And he also takes Art Sheridan, which gives him Chance Masters by the Moonglows and Flamingos. And he exists with Constellation Records. He has a hit here and there with
Just Be
Gene, with
True.
Just Be True, and Bless Our Love, and Nothing Can Stop Me, and Soul Hootenanny, but basically a one-artist label. He never rebuilds a VeeJay out of Constellation. Probably financing's a problem, amongst other things.
So who takes his place?
Okay. They have a black image that they want to maintain, and on the West Coast, he has an employee who was his Western sales and promotion rep named Randy Wood, who formerly worked for Imperial and formerly worked for Cap. So Randy Wood becomes the president of the newly reorganized VeeJay Records.
And Randy Wood becomes a spend-crazy executive.
Randy puts together a management team of a fellow who formerly was with Sinatra's operation. He was the head of the Reprise Sales Corporation. His name was Jay Lasker. He was an attorney who never practiced, who had previously worked for Cap and Decca. Randy knew Lasker from Cap. Lasker was the executive vice president. He brings with him a financial man, Manny Sands. He becomes the controller. And they take a Southerner in, Steve Clark, from Atlanta. And that becomes the new management team of VeeJay Records. They move the company from Chicago to California. They're having tax trouble, so they decide to get out of Chicago. Calvin takes care of Chicago. He remains. And they go west.
The Four Seasons eventually get out of their VeeJay deal and sign with Philips. But Randy Wood is not concerned. Before he left, Abner cut a deal with EMI of London. EMI is the parent company of Capitol Records in America. They had been unsuccessful in trying to sell Capitol USA on two British acts who were going over quite big in the UK. Frank Ifield, a solo act, and a four-member band called the Beatles. EMI approached Abner, impressed with his Four Seasons success, and leased Ifield's I Remember You and the Beatles' first album to VeeJay. VeeJay released Beatles singles in 1963. None of them made it. But by January 1964, it's a whole new story. The Beatles are a phenomenon worldwide. Capitol finally releases I Want to Hold Your Hand. It goes through the roof. And VeeJay, well, it releases all of its Beatles product, including Please Please Me.
What happened with VeeJay was Capitol Records, in an attempt to stop them, starts filing all kinds of lawsuits, 64 counts against them that they don't have rights to get an injunction to stop them because they didn't want anything competing with their Beatle product. Ultimately, they were able to finally get the rights to release it. And like I said,
They had to make the same kind of deal that they made with Crew, right?
not at that point, because this was a throw-in. The deal they made was for Ifield the first time around.
To get the lawsuits out of
To get the suits out of the way, they probably had to come up with something to satisfy Capitol and get them off their back.
I read where one time they had something like 60-some-odd lawsuits.
Yeah, 64 counts
Yeah.
in the litigation. I mean, they accused them of doing everything.
And why didn't EMI they made the mistake. They leased this product to them. Why didn't they just leave these people alone? Let them make their money. Admit they were going to get Beatle product in the future no matter what would happen. So, I mean, why drag this out? Why drag these poor people over the coals? I mean, because of their mistake.
EMI wasn't the problem. Capitol Records was. The U.S. arm of EMI. The people who originally rejected the Beatles.
So why didn't Capitol just, I guess they're covering their butts, right? Because, they're our artists now. You can't take that, even though EMI leased that stuff to them, right?
Well, they figured this little colored company wasn't going to outslick us. We're not going to fatten up any frogs for any snakes. We're not going to spend a fortune here to bring Beatlemania here and let these people cash in on it. We'll scare them with a lawsuit.
Did it work?
No. VeeJay put out their product. They did very well. They had a couple of #1 records there with Love Be Doing, Twist and Shout. They formed Tolly Records. They put out Do You Want to Know a Secret? They put out Please Please Me, like you said. Didn't work at all. VeeJay stood fast. They held their ground.
That's where it is.
The 1964 song, the Shoop Shoop song, It's in Its Kiss, was the first big hit for VeeJay's biggest female act, Betty Everett. While Calvin Carter was producing hits in Chicago, Randy Wood was signing stiffs out in California.
I'm right back. I'll show my love is strong.
The Honeycombs were a Beatles clone signed by Randy Wood.
He decides to go pop with VeeJay. He, in effect, went white. But he doesn't go white with today's talent. He goes back for nostalgia. He goes back in 1963 or 4 and tries to revive Columbia Records of 1952 by signing Arthur Godfrey, Jimmy Boyd, who had I Saw Mommy Kissing Santa Claus. He signed somebody who today works for Barbra Streisand named Gary Lamel, who attempted to have a career as a performer. They took double-page ads for Gary Lamel, and he said Gary Lamel was a white Josh White. Well, he may have been, but he didn't sell any records. Neither did Arthur Godfrey in the 1960s. Neither did Jimmy Boyd. They signed an old vaudeville performer, John W. Bubbles. Randy Wood's selections and talent, unfortunately, did not work out.
What was he smoking?
I don't know, but they were an absolute disaster. I don't think he was guilty of that. I think he was a vodka man.
Okay, what are you drinking? All right, but wait a minute. The guy's signing these crazy acts. What's Jimmy Bracken saying in Chicago? What is this stuff? Does he even say? Does he care?
Well, ultimately, he had to care because he got a phone call from the controller, not Manny Sands. At one point, Jimmy makes a deal to buy out Lasker. Okay, so Lasker and Manny Sands disappear, and he stations somebody else there as his controller, and he gets a call in midweek. Jimmy, you better come out here. Oh, I'll be there next week. I'll book a flight. No, man, you better get here now. They were just out of money in the checkbook. So ultimately, he had to care. I mean, he cared so much, ultimately, he terminated Randy Wood. They moved the company over a weekend from L.A. back to Chicago, and they bring Abner back as general manager.
But the move came a little too late. Randy Wood was fired in June of 1965. Abner returned in October of the same year. Ironically, VeeJay ended up being the third most profitable record label of that year. But by May of 1966, VeeJay was forced to close its Chicago offices and file for Chapter 11. Here's Johnny Meadow again.
I mean, probably the credit was shut off with the pressing plants they used, and probably recording studios they owed money to. They probably were in very bad financial straits. And, you know, from Randy Wood's point of view, he just wanted to keep it going, keep drawing his money.
Eddie Thomas says the Brackens made a mistake in trusting their business to outsiders.
Randy Wood was just he was a carbon copy of you and Abner.
No kidding.
He didn't help matters either. Everybody was for their own self, self-gratitude and gratification. Unfortunately, the company was last. It was like $10 came to the company and $50 came to the individual.
And Jerry Butler eventually left VeeJay in May of 1966. He signed with Mercury Records. Ewart Abner went to work for Motown Records in Berry Gordy. The Brackens, Jimmy and his wife Vivian, passed on, and Randy Wood and Calvin Carter are also no longer with us. These were the major players at VeeJay Records. And according to Johnny Meadow,
I don't think anybody can deny them the success they had. I don't think anybody can deny them. The only problem was the mismanagement. They made $50,000, they spent $65,000. But as far as, the contributions they made in terms of talent, I don't think anybody can take that from them. And I don't think anybody can take the marketing ability from them. They were definitely somebody to be reckoned with. I mean, they beat the hell out of Warner Brothers records on the cover of the Shoop Shoop song. Warner Brothers had a record on it by somebody, Ramona King or something. They didn't get anything. I guess we're doing this show today because the Brackens have really never gotten their just due in terms of their contribution, even amongst their own black people. The names Vivian and Jimmy Bracken outside of Chicago or Gary, Indiana, are probably not even known.
Yet VeeJay accomplished so much. The label is still alive, believe it or not. A revived VeeJay attempted a comeback thanks to producer-songwriter Billy Vera.
I got a call from Dan Pritzker, who's the son of the Pritzker brothers who own the Hyatt hotels and, big shots in Chicago. And he informed me that they had bought the VeeJay label from the previous owner, and would I be interested in doing some reissue work for them, as I had done for the specialty label when Fantasy bought it. So I said, sure, I love VeeJay and love the music on the label. And so we got together and decided that we were going to put out 10 CDs per quarter, and mix them up a little bit, 2 gospel and maybe 3 jazz and then 5 rock and roll and rhythm and blues. So we did that, and it lasted for about, I guess a year and a half. And then they sort of decided to fold up and sort of not put out anything else. After that, we had pretty much covered most of the important things that were on the label.
And Billy Vera says right now they're just holding on to it. Will we ever see another VeeJay Records?
Well, I think for anybody to start an independent label nowadays is really difficult because records cost so much to produce now. Whereas you could have made a record by the Spaniels in 1954 for $200. Now it costs you $10,000 to make a record. So your startup costs are a lot greater. Payola apparently has gotten way out of hand. Where you could pay a guy $50 a month to play your records. Now you're talking, from what I'm told, a cost of $100,000 to get a record into the top 20 nationally. So, it just costs so much. So a young guy starting in the business, or a young couple starting in the business like Jimmy and Vivian did, boy, it's much more complicated now than it ever was. And as you see, the corporations are pretty much running the record business today.
Is there a moral to this story, Johnny Meadow?
Watch your checkbook, huh? No, really, you've got to watch your business. Can't really run a business absentee and just delegate it to others. That doesn't work.
And that concludes our look at the rise and fall of VeeJay Records. At this time, I would like to thank our participants, music historian Johnny Meadow, former manager Eddie Thomas, and producer-songwriter Billy Vera. And we thank you for listening. I'm Bob Slade. Keep a good thought and have a good day.